You heard that her body was found. Have you been over to where she was found?
No, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go to that place and be like, oh, this is where she died. That's wonderful. Like, why would I want to see that?
We're going to do this now, or?
We're going to do it now.
Okay.
Is that something that's okay?
Yeah, I mean, I know I didn't do anything, so it should be good.
Katelyn Markham was a gentle sweetheart who, one summer night, would suddenly vanish without a trace. Her fiancé would report her disappearance the following day, citing that he had seen her the night before. But when she failed to text him good morning and then failed to make it to work, all of her loved ones knew that something terrible must have happened. The problem is, Katelyn's case was allegedly never addressed sufficiently, with private investigators claiming that law enforcement was slow and unresponsive. And sadly, eventually, her case would indeed turn cold. That would be until the year 2023, when, all of a sudden, groundbreaking discoveries were made. So, would Katelyn Markham and her family ever receive the justice they deserved? And what precisely happened to her? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, folks. My name is Adrian, and welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime. Now, this story took more than an entire decade to write itself, and those who knew the victim were waiting for 13 grueling long years. But finally, I can share this solved story. And also, just to mention, if you like true crime and strange or dark stories, then please do consider subscribing. I post up to twice a week here. And now, with all of that said, please grab yourself a coffee, take a seat, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Katelyn Markham. Welcome to Ohio, folks. Located in the northeast of the United States, this charming state shares a border with Canada along the shores of one of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie. If you step away from the shoreline and travel southwest, you will eventually find yourself in Cincinnati. Sitting right next to its neighboring state, Kentucky, and only a stone's throw away from Indiana, this city has quite a strong country vibe, particularly in the south. That said, it is also a city that doesn't quite know what it is. Rather famous for its friendliness and hospitality, Cincinnati hosts various events yearly. In combination with this, the abundance of breweries in the city makes it the perfect place for its annual Oktoberfest event. And of course, you can't forget about Findlay Market, which makes it a bustling place to be in the spring and summer. And one of those living in the area of Cincinnati, in a small town named Fairfield, was Katelyn Markham. Born in the heat of summer on August 16, 1990, to her parents Dave Markham and Charma Rader, Katelyn was born and bred to be a true Cincinnatian. Ever since she was a baby, she was highly well loved and grew up as a bubbly young girl, followed by her sister Allie, who is 4 years younger. It is said that Katelyn took to being an older sister just like a duck to water, and the pair would grow increasingly close over the years, relishing in the shared experience of growing up with both of their parents. Now, although their parents would sadly eventually split up during their childhood, the two sisters would remain very close to both of their parents, and both their mother and father would continue to support and raise their family with a lot of love. It is also noted that Katelyn was incredibly close with her father, which is evident through the many photographs of the two of them together. She was increasingly close with him throughout her teenagerhood, where her unique and lovable personality shone through. Katelyn was described as one of the most likable people that you could ever meet, always making sure that, even in a crowded room, everyone knew that she was paying attention to them, brightening their days with goofy antics and vibrant laughter. In her teenage years, she grew into her passion for arts, focusing on her school education and always volunteering to create pieces for murals and public events. Those who knew her said that she had a flair for color to match her bright personality. It was with this personality that Katelyn would attract her first long-term boyfriend at the end of high school. He was a local boy and 18 years old, and his name was John Carter. So, it was in August of 2011 that, much like the rest of Cincinnati, the outer suburb of Fairfield was well underway with summer celebrations. This included both Katelyn and John, who would often go for walks to enjoy the summer warmth. However, after a long day of festivities, Fairfield police received a disturbing phone call from a very distressed and worried man. The phone call was made by no one other than John Carter, and he was calling to report that his fiancée, Katelyn Markham, was missing.
Hi, my name is John Carter. I am calling. I know that you're not supposed to report a missing person before 24 hours, but my fiance is missing. I can't find her anywhere.
Okay, where did you see her last?
I saw her at like 12 o'clock last night. She stays in a house by herself, I'm really nervous. Her car is still there.
Where was she at midnight last night when you left?
She was at her house. She was going to bed. She wasn't going out to do anything, so she would have been in her bed. And I mean, I've been with her for 6 years. She's not deceiving, she doesn't.
Okay, and you guys didn't have an argument or anything?
Not at all. The only thing that's not there is her cell phone, which is positive, but she's not answering it. So, and the Sacred Heart Festival is going on right up the street, and there's a lot of questionable people there, and it's just kind of, I'm sorry.
Now, according to John, he hadn't actually seen Katelyn since the previous evening around midnight. Apparently, he then left her home found on Dorset Drive to return to his mother's. When asked if the two had any arguments that evening, he strongly declined. Apparently, it was just a very typical evening before he returned home. Now, John claimed that, after returning home, both he and Katelyn shared several messages with each other over the following hours. However, by the morning, she had stopped responding. To make matters even worse, Katelyn's phone had now run out of battery, meaning he couldn't message her. And as the hours passed by, he was growing increasingly concerned. Silence may be concerning dependent on the person. For Katelyn, she never had her phone off, and she would always message John in the morning. So yes, this was unusual for her. Now, while alarming, this was not necessarily uncommon for police to hear. Katelyn was a 21-year-old woman and was plenty capable of looking after herself. And so, with less than 24 hours having passed between her disappearance and John reporting her missing, very little was initially done to locate her. However, John was not convinced, because Katelyn would never just blank him and leave. I mean, even at the end of this story and in hindsight, that is true. Moving into the next day, and as the news of her disappearance spread around town, friends, family, and peers all began to worry. They all agreed that this was not like her, and when she failed to show up to work the following day, everyone knew that something abnormal had happened. You see, not only was Katelyn a very punctual worker, but she would often show up early or give plenty of notice when her plans changed. And so, upon hearing this, John decided to return to her residence and see if he could do any investigating of his own. After arriving, all appeared to be as it should have been. Her car was in the driveway, her dog was running around in the yard as usual, and nothing seemed out of place. But again, there was no sign of Katelyn. I mean, her dog alone in the yard was just another red flag too, because being Katelyn, she would have never left him unattended. Something was very, very wrong here, and so, with time passing by, the authorities finally deemed it to be time to treat her disappearance as an official missing persons case. Naturally, the investigation began at the last place that she was seen, including an investigation into the last person she was seen by. Stating the obvious here, that meant that John Carter and her Dorset Drive townhouse were two key elements of interest. Beginning with her home, nothing seemed out of place, excluding the eerie silence left in her absence. Her phone was also missing, suggesting that she may have gone with it. However, her purse, keys, and dog all remained in the property. As for John, well, his alibi was actually quite rock solid. His mother would confirm that on that night he had returned home to her rather than staying at Katelyn's. Now, she did admit that this was rather unusual for him, but definitely not unheard of. With little to no leads suggesting as to where Katelyn could be, a public plea was spread around the town, looking for any helpful information. And as it would happen, a significant public movement was then established to help try and find her. Family, friends, and the community would all come together here, determined for answers. However, before we continue, let's first talk about the relationship between John and Katelyn. The pair were described as being joined at the hip and were both quirky and very likable teens, with their relationship surviving past the end of high school and well into adulthood. After graduating from Fairfield High School, Katelyn further pursued her passion for art and enrolled at the Art Institute of Ohio to further her studies in the field. And while here, she would continue to grow her friendship circle and deepen her relationship with John. As for John, well, he too was also born in Cincinnati. Saying hi to the world in the year 1988, he had a very comfortable upbringing, and that was thanks to his father, who owned a fair amount of property in the area. John was noted as being a jolly, happy-go-lucky young boy, and grew into an eccentric and friendly teenager before meeting Katelyn just before turning 18 years old. Now, as far as anyone could tell, their relationship was seemingly going swimmingly. Not only did Katelyn's family love John, but they also seemed to take their partnership very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that the pair would go on to get engaged in early 2011, where they planned to get married in the following 2 or 3 years. With her studies well underway and a wedding to plan and save for, Katelyn also worked on the side at a bridal shop to try and get by and save money not only for her, but John's future too. She worked at David's Bridal, the same bridal shop that she failed to show up at as expected on that fateful morning. And with all of this happening only a few days before her 22nd birthday, it is no wonder that many of her family and friends were extremely concerned. This, of course, also meant her fiancé, who had now been together with her for 6 long years. The public reaction to Katelyn's disappearance was one of confusion and great turmoil. She was never one to just simply go off on her own or to act out in defiance. And so, fearing something malicious may have happened to her, the general public conducted several search parties, spreading out far and wide from her Fairfield townhouse and into the rural lands around them. Parks, forests and waterways in Butler and Hamilton counties were all scoured by anyone and everyone, from local neighboring authorities right through to the general public, and even a mounted police force who took to the wilderness to search for her. But sadly, all efforts were to no avail, and again, no sign of Katelyn was ever found. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. As time passed by, the pressure would gradually build up. Televised pleas from her worried friends and family, and, of course, her fiancé, were broadcast throughout the state in an effort to gather any information regarding her disappearance. And through the reports and the rumors which were all going around, you could just tell how frantic everyone was becoming.
I keep believing that if she is somewhere in the worst case scenario, that she fights her way out. I keep wanting to believe that because she's strong. I know she's strong. So she's got to manage to make her way out.
But sadly, all of these efforts would be in vain. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into an entire year. Meanwhile, Katelyn hadn't been seen once. No substantial leads were uncovered in her townhouse, and there didn't seem to be any particular persons of interest to officers. And so naturally, this really infuriated her family, who just seemed to be adamant that malice was involved. Pretty much everybody seemed to be stumped here, and of course, there were rumors circulating around the community. Some believed it could have been a random stranger, while others started to look at Katelyn's boyfriend. But John, well, he simply pushed those allegations to the side. I mean, he was literally engaged to her, so why would he want to harm her? No news of her disappearance would come for a very, very long time. That was until April the 7th, 2013, which, by the way, was a solid 20 months since she had vanished. It was on that day that a young couple was scouring a creek which could be found along Big Cedar Road in Cedar Grove, Indiana. The creek was located roughly 40 kilometers or 30 miles east of Fairfield, which, in other words, was only a short drive away from Katelyn's home. When it came to the wilderness, the couple were quite familiar with various animals and wildlife that could be found in the area. So, When they came across several scattered bones on their search, they initially assumed them to be that of an animal. However, upon closer inspection and the discovery of a skull, it became quite obvious that they were dealing with something far more suspicious. And when they found even more bones, all of which resembling a human in the creek, it all but confirmed their morbid suspicions. That is when they called 911. Now, the news would unfortunately get out rather quickly. However, it would take some time to confirm who the body belonged to via forensic evaluation. I mean, they did seem to fit Katelyn's profile, and sadly, their fears were not wrong either. That is because only 2 weeks later, the confirmation would come through. These bones did in fact belong to Katelyn Markham. This, of course, would destroy all hope for Katelyn's friends and family, who were all now forced to accept that they would never see her alive again. And despite knowing that she was now dead, nobody knew how she had died or what had killed her. With that said, the authorities were now faced with a new task. Not to locate Katelyn Markham herself, but to provide justice and closure to those who loved her. And so, with that said, they began their work on tracking down her killer. Forensic analysts were faced with a very difficult challenge here. With Katelyn passing more than 1 year prior, only her bones were left behind, leaving little evidence to aid in their investigations. The only notable marks left on the remains were on her left wrist bone, which were 4 sharp blunt force trauma wounds. And despite these marks, it was concluded that they were not enough to cause her death. It was also determined that, at the point of discovery of her remains, that her body was likely moved for a second time after initially being dumped elsewhere. As a result, the coroner kept Katelyn's remains for several months, therefore delaying her funeral. This means that it wasn't until August of 2023 that her family could finally officially mourn their loss. Friends, family, teachers, and colleagues would hold a memorial at Fairfield High School, where many others turned up to pay their respects towards Katelyn. The town banded together to remember her, with many tears and smiles along the way. With Katelyn's funeral now over, the only thing left to find out was how she had died, and more specifically, who had murdered her. Nobody believed this was an accident, and by nobody, I mean absolutely nobody. However, with so much time passing since her death, people did start to fear that they would never find out who. And so, it was at this moment that Katelyn's father made the smart decision to lobby the Butler County Sheriff's Office to re-examine the case. After all, Dave knew that there was far more to this story, and that his daughter did not put herself in that creek. He just believed at this point in time that the case had been poorly handled. I mean, Katelyn was happy, and she talked to her father about everything. And it didn't seem like she was particularly anxious, because in fact she was looking forward to her future with John. But on the subject of John, well, he had turned very silent in the months after Katelyn's death. In fact, by the time her body had been discovered, he had basically cut all contact from her family. And yes, they did find this extraordinarily suspicious. The lack of motivation from officers frustrated her family quite significantly. Imagine losing a loved one and then watching all efforts dry up. I mean, her remains had been found, but that simply wasn't enough. Not only did the Markham family want justice, but they deserved it too. 3 years later, they were still fighting and searching. In the year 2016, a documentary titled Taken Too Soon, The Katelyn Markham Story, was released to the public in hope that it would spark some new motivation. And then in 2017, Ryan Green, who was a private investigator, was hired to examine the case. Sadly, he would eventually come out with no additional information. Instead, he deeply criticized Fairfield and Butler County officials' slow and sloppy progress on the case. The question is, would we have had more answers if serious action had been taken as soon as Katelyn had disappeared? As recently as the year 2020, Katelyn's death was featured on Discovery ID on the show Still a Mystery, in what would be the Markham's family most prolific attempt to try and catch her killer. Now, you may be thinking at this point, with Katelyn's case cold for a total of 9 years, that I may be bringing you an open-ended story today. Although work was slow, progress is still progress, especially when a positive outcome is found. And as it turns out, the authorities had been gathering snippets of evidence for a very long time. But it wouldn't be until a staggering 12 years after her murder that one key piece of information would find its way to detectives. Information which cast a very harsh spotlight on the man who seemed to be both the most and the least likely person to cause harm to Katelyn. And of course, I'm talking about John Carter. But before officers made it to him, they would have to make one additional arrest first. And here we will meet another John named Jonathan Palmerton. Jonathan was John Carter's friend and former roommate, and after making it into detective sights for all of the wrong reasons, he was finally arrested on February the 17th, 2023 under perjury charges. With a successful charge, officers had the right to search his home, a home that just so happened to be where John was living at the time that Katelyn disappeared. It seemed that whoever was now working on Katelyn's case was now on the right track. You see, back when her remains were discovered, officers initially interrogated Jonathan, and although he may have slipped away from their radar in the year 2013, he was once again under fresh suspicion. Now, although Jonathan became a key suspect in the case, he wasn't actually the main guy that detectives were going for. In fact, it was John Carter they wanted instead. You see, throughout the years, small pieces of circumstantial evidence were slowly adding up against him, and although they were individually never enough to build a solid case against John Carter, they were definitely enough to keep him at the forefront of their minds. With Jonathan successfully caught lying to officers, which we assumed to be a misalignment between his story and confirmed information, police now believed that all of these lies were to protect John from being found responsible. And so, ultimately, on March the 22nd, 2023, John Carter, who was now 34 years old, married and with children, was finally arrested on suspicion of being involved in the disappearance and eventual murder of Katelyn Markham.
You got nothing else on you? Ready to like nothing in your drawers? No.
Actually, one more time.
Go butt first.
His bond was set at $1 million, while authorities had the chance to compile all evidence against him. As mentioned, unfortunately, their proof was not as robust as a typical case of homicide, but it did strongly allude to his motives and his actions. To begin with, it was noted that in his initial interview, officers observed scratch marks on his neck, which at the time he blamed on shaving. Interestingly, he would then later change his story and claim that he couldn't remember how he got them. To add to this, officers would also note a passive slip of tenses. During his interviews with officers and then the media, and even in private conversations, John would refer to Katelyn in the past tense only a few days after she went missing. An innocent person would hold out hope and not assume she was dead. So, why was he referring to her as if she had now passed away? Of course, with this case taking so long, all forensic avenues had been explored and exhausted. This included the controversial use of polygraph tests, which John had conducted in 2011, 2014, and 2021. Interestingly, not one or two, but all three of them had alluded that John had given deceptive responses when asked if he was involved. It was also revealed that digital forensics conducted on John's phone stated that on the night of August the 14th, he was inactive for 15 hours from the early morning to the mid-afternoon. It is noted that this is the most likely window of time when Katelyn was murdered and then her body was concealed. And although John claimed that he and Katelyn had been texting the night prior, well, there was no digital evidence to back that up. Telephone operators could not confirm that either of them were busy on their phones, and John had claimed that he had accidentally deleted those messages. Well, isn't that convenient? The last piece of circumstantial evidence to come forward was actually from Katelyn's neighbor, who claimed that, on the night that she disappeared, she heard some sort of muffled dialogue coming from the house. Apparently, it sounded rather confrontational, and that furthermore, she would hear the words "no" repeated over and over again. However, it wouldn't be until a private investigation was conducted and several role changes were made in the police department that an arrest was finally made, and that would be John Palmerton in 2023. With Jonathan now behind bars, he would now become more susceptible to revealing multiple holes in John Carter's story, and thankfully, that is precisely what would happen. While all of this was going on, investigators made their way to John Carter's house to see what they could find. And honestly, what they found was not only surprising, but very stupid too. I'm talking crude drawings, poetry, and even notes, all of which were alluding to the murder of his own fiancée. I mean, how dumb can you be? John's notes and drawings alluded to an angel in the woods, with one passage writing, "I slit your wrists with the key to your heart." It is noted that this passage is linked to the only known injury found on Katelyn's remains. John's haunting journal painted the picture of a man who was fighting with the fantasy of taking his lover's life, with a recovered poem reading, "Deep down, I love her. You want to kill her. But I love her. She must die. I can't kill her. Yes, you can. No. Yes." All of this fresh evidence, which had only surfaced after John was arrested and his home searched, helped build an even stronger case against him. It's one of those situations where you can't simply rummage around someone's home on a mere weak assumption. However, if you are correct with those assumptions, they really can pay off. They were also kind of lucky here. I mean, what kind of intelligent person in their right mind would even think about writing these fantasies down for the whole world to find out? I guess you could say that John Carter was not the brightest crayon in the box. He was 2 pennies short of a nickel, and that elevator in his mind never really made it all the way to the top. Throughout legal proceedings, John actually managed to post his $1 million bond and was able to return home under GPS tracking while he waited for his trial. This was scheduled for June of 2023, where he was to go on trial for murder. And although prosecutors wanted to enact further charges, such as abuse of a corpse, Ohio's statute of limitations would ultimately deny it. This was because Katelyn's corpse was only found after 2 years after her death, therefore diminishing any convincing evidence towards any of these additional charges. After lawyering up and receiving legal advice from his team, John Carter's tune changed. Despite initially claiming that he was innocent, he would then go on to plead guilty to involuntary murder before his trial could even take place. This was actually quite smart from his defense team, because it meant that it prevented him from standing trial for murder. The prosecution concluded that, coupled with the neighbor's testimony, John and Katelyn must have gotten into an argument on the night that she was murdered. And although they seemed happily engaged and had plans to move away, friends did come forward to claim that their relationship was strained behind closed doors. Katelyn's friends testified that, in the months leading up to her death, she felt increasingly trapped in her relationship, and perhaps this could have been the subject of their argument on the fateful night that she lost her life. John then admitted to disposing of her body in an area that he was familiar with, that being Cedar Creek, where his family used to own some property. He told this story to the judge before then admitting that he panicked after accidentally killing Katelyn, leading to his guilty plea of involuntary manslaughter. Unfortunately, his plea would ultimately be accepted by the courts, meaning that he would not have to go ahead with trial for murder. And so, on July the 18th, 2023, John Carter was sentenced to a ridiculous and measly 3 years in prison. Even worse, John showed no remorse during his sentencing. He didn't speak, showed no emotion, and hardly reacted to any comments made by the judge. Unfortunately, the judge's hands were also tied in this situation. His 3-year sentence was the maximum permitted in a case of manslaughter. If you ask me or anyone else on the streets, this seems like a terribly small punishment after murdering someone and then keeping it a secret for 13 long years. It is infuriating to say the least. Not only had a woman lost the best part of 60 years of her life, but her entire family were left suspended in absolute agony for 13 long years. And as a result, all this man gets is a slap on the wrist and only 3 years in a prison cell. Well, that is just an insult. Needless to say, while Katelyn's family are relieved to finally have answers to their burning questions, they feel that John never got the punishment he thoroughly deserved. The fact that he had been roaming free for over a decade alongside them has left them extremely angry. In fact, Katelyn's younger sister had even passed John multiple times while he was out in public with his family, living his life as if nothing had happened. Katelyn was a much-loved member of the Fairfield community by friends and family alike, and her story has been circulating for over a decade in the town. The community banded together to find her, and once she was found, they banded together to mourn their loss. At her funeral, memorials, and even in court, her friends and loved ones wore butterflies on their shirts in honor of her. Her father reminisced about his lost daughter, saying, "Katelyn loved butterflies. They remind me of her. I often wonder what she'd be doing with her art and her career. And I think she would just be such an amazing woman." And it does make me angry that he lived for 12 years scot-free, thinking he got away with it. I do not feel that 3 years is justice, not for Katelyn, not for her sister, not for me, her friends, or the entire community that has ached and grieved alongside us. Not a day goes by that I don't think about Katelyn. Dave Markham and his family are working to set a new set of legislation called Katelyn's Law, a law that would allow prosecutors to bring more charges forward in cases of involuntary manslaughter. Katelyn was taken from her family far too soon, and is remembered as her bubbly, smiling, goofy, and artistic self by those who continue to remember her. Alongside Katelyn's family, we can all only hope that, one day, John will pay for the pain caused through death and through concealment. And with that said, I think I'll leave this case here today, folks. A case that I find incredibly frustrating. However, what I will say is at least we have some sort of closure. Before I go though, I do have a couple questions for you. To begin with, do you think that this was a planned murder or merely an accident? And also, what do you think about John's sentence? As always, please share your thoughts in the comments section down below. Now personally, I do have a feeling that he had planned this, but whether it was an accident or not, he should definitely have more time behind bars. As mentioned in the recent video, I don't yet have my studio set up, so at the moment it's this kind of crude recording setup. However, in about 2 or 3 videos I should be good to go. If you want to support me in the channel in the meantime, please check out my Patreon here, or alternatively, follow me on social media here, most notably my Instagram. As always folks, thank you so much for watching today, I really do appreciate it, and thank you for your patience. I'll see you again very soon for another video. However, until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and as always, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.